My name is Jordan Forrest, and today I'm going to be talking about kicking the cliche or keeping the creative in our creative writing. I think this is a super important topic for us writers, especially because we spend a lot of time in language, and so it can be easy to return to things that are maybe overused. So really my goal today is to talk about places that we might be using cliche, maybe in unexpected ways in our writing, and then ways that we can try and push past that, ways we can start rethinking and reinventing the ideas that we're working with. I want to start by exploring what cliché even is. Interestingly enough, the word cliché comes from the French cliché, which was used in printmaking and is actually an onomatopoeia for the sound that the metal plate made when they replicated words, phrases, or images. So it's really fitting for this idea of repetition. Now we consider cliché to mean overuse so as to have lost meaning, and I really appreciate what Merriam-Webster has said about this. It refers to anything that is so commonplace that it lacks freshness or offers nothing new in the way of interest or insight. I think this is a really helpful idea and definition to keep in mind as we're thinking about ways to keep our writing fresh. One good thing to keep in mind is that each genre, fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, may have their own cliches within the genre that are kind of niche. So, for example, fiction might have certain fantasy cliches that are important to know about. So, whichever genre you're working in, it's good to have a familiarity with it so that you can kind of work away from those common cliches. To begin, let's start with cliche in language. This is probably the place that we're all the most familiar with hearing about cliche. I start with overused phrases. Often these are things that are said quite often or are just used to the point of losing meaning. This could be that lasted an eternity, she has nerves of steel, this is the calm before the storm, he has a bleeding heart. All of these are things that are used quite often. Honestly, you can go online and look up hundreds of these types of phrases. It's a really good way to get familiar with maybe even cliches that you don't realize you're using that you just put into your language automatically. Next is overused comparisons, and this is really important to know about as creative writers. Often metaphors or similes will be created with things that are frequently used in comparison. So that could be love being compared to a rose, struggle to a storm or a climb, or even the eyes to the stars. These are things that are just quick and often used without much thought, and what we really want to do as writers is push past that. Next is cliche characters. Now, this isn't to say tropes are bad. There are certain character types that are often used in literature, and that is totally okay. However, there must be a certain understanding for what trope you're playing into, making sure that your character is authentic, intentional, and fresh in some ways. Some good examples of cliche characters that we see is the orphan who defeats the evil villain. This could be Harry Potter, or is often seen in other places, or the wise old mentor who dies in the end. You could see this in lots of fantasy types. And then maybe the popular bully. This is really frequent. Think Regina George or Sharpay from High School Musical. All of these are places to be aware of already existing types and making sure that we're working against that or at least bringing something fresh. And if the use is intentional, that cliche, then really playing that up and really working with it in ironic and sarcastic ways. I want to talk a little bit now about cliche and subject matter. This is a little bit more of a subtle cliche that we might not be as aware of. This is the overuse of a certain idea, a theme, or a topic. I often see this in my own creative writing classes, that there are things that are frequently coming up, and that's okay, but there has to be a fresh way of approaching it. Some examples of these are a breakup, like a breakup poem or a breakup piece. The next is the love triangle. Again, these are ideas that we see frequently, and we just have to be aware of how often they are used and work against that. Another way that subject matter can be cliche is in the overuse of an approach to a subject. So one common way that this is seen is like mutilation of the body. So I gouged my eyes out for you, or he tore my heart out and watched it bleed. This sort of physical attention to the body is very common, especially in poetry, and so that's something to be aware of. Other common approaches to keep in mind are the first person narrator describing themselves in the mirror and speaking to the ambiguous you, which is often I see this cliche mostly appear in poetry where the narrator is speaking to someone, either a lover or a family member or a friend, and it's not quite clear who they are connecting with. And again, it's just good to keep in mind that these are approaches that are often turned to, and using that knowledge to create something fresh or create something at least authentic for you. The last place I want to talk about cliche is the movement of a piece. Now, this is a little bit trickier to describe, but what this really is when we are using a trajectory in our poetry, our fiction, or nonfiction that is often overdone or unoriginal. Really, this is how we take a piece from its beginning to its end, and oftentimes there are at least predictable moves that can be made or unsatisfying moves because they've been done so much, things like that to be aware of. So some examples of this is the bad guy turned good. That's a common trope that we see, especially in fiction. You might have the heartbroken first-person narrator who ends maybe the poem in this place of anger or resolution. And last example is a first-person narrator. Often this would be, I've seen this in poetry or nonfiction, where they decide all is lost and nothing will ever get better. So these are places to be aware that these are really overdone trajectories. And it's not to say that you can't take your piece in that place, but it's important to remember complication, to remember contradiction and paradox, and to remember, okay, what's fresh and authentic and honest. And these are all things that we'll get a little bit more into as we talk about ways to work against cliche. Now, if in thinking about this and hearing about this, you're thinking, oh man, like, how do I make sure I recognize this type of cliche? That is totally understandable, and even I feel consistently inadequate in my ability to recognize things that are overused. That is totally normal, and I think the best thing we can do is read. The best thing we can do is get a really good understanding of what's happening in the literature in the past and in the present, and what directions things are often taken. So if you're interested in poetry, read so much of it. If you're interested in fantasy, read so much of it, and read across genre. But I think it's so important to know what is already happening in the work and what are already common types played with. Another thing I would suggest doing is researching cliches online. There are tons of resources that can help you understand, especially in the language side of cliche, what things to avoid and what things to be aware of. There's a good link that I put here that has 681 cliches for creative writers, so there's just good options to really make yourself aware of as far as the research goes. Now that we've reviewed places where cliche exists in our writing and in our ideas, I do want to be clear that it is totally okay to use some of these common conventions. This doesn't mean that you can't write about heartbreak, you can't write the chosen one. What I really want to emphasize here is that it's just important to be aware of where cliche can exist. And then your job is to know what's overdone so that you can make something fresh or nuanced or complicated in its place. So it's really a matter of learning so that you can push past that. Another important thing to keep in mind is sometimes we use cliche on purpose, and it helps us to be ironic or to poke fun at something. A good example of this is Mean Girls, where the Regina George character is really a common popular girl bully trope. However, there is some sort of a comedy inherent in that use of the cliche. So again, it's just being aware of where cliche exists and not using it in a way that is maybe not informed of its overuse, but using it in a way that is intentional or fresh as well. So let's look at kicking the cliche in language. In my opinion, the heart of kicking the cliche in our language or our comparisons is really connecting to what we really are trying to say. I think sometimes we revert to cliche comparisons when we don't quite know what it is we're getting to the heart of. So take a step back and say, well, okay, what am I really trying to say at this moment? For example, our love was like a flame. This is quite a cliche. Often love and passion are compared to fires. But if you pin it down to what the honesty of that statement is, it's saying our love was intense, which already doesn't that feel a little bit better, a little more true, a little more simple? I love Toni Morrison's quote here, love is or it ain't, then love ain't love at all. This is simple. It's nothing extravagant that she said, but it's truth. And she stripped down language that could become cliche or overused. And then if you want, you can take that a simple idea that you've pinned down, our love was intense, and push it back out to figurative language by thinking about something intense in a fresh way. So what's intense and unique, and then putting that back in to the figurative language. And then we can always just return, though, to Jack Kerouac's words, "One day I will find the right words and they will be simple." If you're really struggling with that cliche language, feeling like your words are sounding like something else, feeling overdone, feeling used and dull, just go back to the heart of what you're trying to say and say it as simply and as truly as possible. And I think you'll find something really magic in that moment. Next, I want to talk about kicking the cliche in our characters. One of the most interesting things I've heard about character development recently was to develop a love for your characters. I think this is really powerful because when we really love our characters and come to see them as full people, we will make them more real, more authentic, and pull away from cliche naturally. Next, I would say get to know your character personally. If you understand that they have their own desires, their own personality, I think it makes them more real, more complicated, and more unique. And so all of those things help to push us past just an initial cliche. Especially when they're personally known to us, I think we realize that there's something inherently different about them. And so they become more like people that we know. Next, I would say make a list of possible attributes, and especially steer away from using those regular constructions. See which ones are more unique. See what characteristics can pair together to make someone really different, and to push past a cliche or a trope in form. And last, I would say, this is just an idea, but what if you based it off of someone you know? So base a character off of someone who already is real and full and complicated to you, and I think inherently it will help pull you away from using cliche. Next, I want to look at kicking the cliche in subject matter and movement. I went ahead and combined these because I think they use really similar techniques for pushing into a more fresh and more creative space. I look at this in the form of questions. So I started with, what is most compelling about this idea? Let's say you're working with the idea of heartbreak. There is a lot of writing about that. But where you're really going to get a new perspective, a really fresh take, is by thinking, what's most compelling to me? Why am I interested in writing about this? Then the writing will come from a more authentic, more heart-filled place. And additionally, when you understand what's compelling to you, often that's what's compelling to other people as well. The next question I have is, what is a different angle? So this is one of our best tools as creative writers, is thinking about maybe a typically done idea, but looking at it from a new light. So if you're looking at love, maybe you bring in some sort of research that you've been doing recently about Iceland. It's a different way in, and there might be something really unique there. Or maybe you bring in your own experience that has a new angle and way of looking at this. Then the last question is, what is an interesting paradox here? This is one of my new favorite ways for thinking about how to push my writing into a more fresh, more unique place. I think it's really helpful when we consider, okay, what is inherently true about this in a contradictory way? So perhaps when you're looking at the idea of love, you're saying it's paradoxical that the feelings that should be the most stagnant are also the ones that are changing the most. I don't know, something like that. But I think paradox can really open up ideas and push our subject matter and the movement of that subject matter into a more unique place. Now, if you're thinking about how to really explore creating more fresh, more unique language, I really would look to brainstorming. And I'm super aware that that is a cliche word perhaps, but I think this is one of our best tools. So I have a few ideas. One, try setting a timer, maybe for 10 minutes, let's say, and just write down a bunch of ideas about something that you're struggling to push past cliche. So let's say that's a character. You just write 10 minutes of characteristics. Or maybe that's a metaphor for love. You write 10 minutes of like all the ideas you can think about. And I think it really helps us because it forces our brain to push past the first few thoughts, which maybe are often the first few thoughts everyone has, and it also just pushes us into a more creative, more anything goes space. Then I would say journal about the 3 questions on the previous slide, or even just journal about a cliche you're really struggling with. I find that writing out longhand how we're thinking about something really helps our brain move through it. And lastly, there's this really great idea of just doing a 45-minute no bad ideas brainstorm session. So, just like riffing on music, you just spend some time and explore whatever comes to mind and really get something fresh out of that. I hope that through this presentation you found something that's really helpful for you and helps you as you try to push past your own cliche tendencies, because I know I have mine. Truly, my biggest advice would be to just not worry so much about saying something good, but say something honest. And I think that's when our best work comes through. I think we struggle the most with cliche when we're being insincere in our writing. And so just connecting with our own authenticity. And some of the best advice I've ever received about writing is to really connect with what you find beautiful in the world. So I think when we really understand what we find interesting about being human and about looking out and about seeing, I think we connect with what is most fresh and original and authentic in our writing. And that would be what I leave you with. Thank you.